Hello, everyone. Welcome to our uh, presentation on media challenges and opportunities in sports during COVID-19. We have four outstanding presenters, including, but not limited to, Dr. Eddie O'Connor, Dr. Michelle Karoulis, Dr. Russ Flatten, and Dr. Harold Schnitsky. I have been involved in AASP since the early 90s. I actually trained with a woman named Dr. Betty Wenz in 82 and 83 at Cal State Hayward, as it was called back then, and have done a lot of work with a whole variety of sports. And as I have moved on or progressed in this profession, I've really taken a special interest in females in sport. My first book was Sisterhood in Sports, How Female Athletes Collaborate and Compete. And my second book was Stand Up and Shout Out, Women's Fight for Equal Pay, Equal Rights, and Equal Opportunities in Sports. So I will be kind of facilitating this panel, this very talented, terrific, and knowledgeable panel going forward. I actually also am a licensed clinical psychologist and a CMP, certified mental performance consultant, and on the registry of sports psychology for the Olympic folks. Anyhow, the title of our presentation is Media Challenges and Opportunities in Sports During COVID-19. The challenges posed by COVID-19 have been given rise to innovation in media and sports. Once the serious side effects of the pandemic became clear, people at all levels of sport were forced to widen their methods of communication and participation, particularly through social media. This has provided a venue for increasing positive public relations for all levels of athletes. This important topic, it will address current concerns in the diverse sporting community, from keeping youth involved in sports to using technology to deal with sports cancellations and some information about female athletes. During COVID-19, social media became key for sports discussions. Sportscasters were posed to provide ongoing connections for players with fans, television, and social media. This became an essential tool for this connection to continue. This symposium will discuss the effects of COVID-19 on sports media, especially regarding Black, Indigenous, people of color, and female athletes. It will include those groups. The techniques speaking to address a lack of equity and inclusion in the media will be discussed. Each presentation will be presented with an eye to diversity in the media. The first presenter will discuss the impact and most effective use of social media in the athletic community. The second presenter will look behind the curtains on identification and treatment of COVID-19 and NCAA student athletes. Following that, an overview of the needs of student athletes in terms of mental health will be covered. Finally, the symposium reviews how a particular psyching team dealt with the cancellation of a major race through social media. This symposium will include a discussion at the end with comments on the different areas in the media that were affected by COVID-19. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce your first presenter, Dr. Eddie O'Connor, who will be talking about using social media to encourage your athletic community.
Thanks very much, Joan. Okay, so let's get started. Using social media to encourage your athletic community. Let me start off by maybe giving you a little bit of context of where I'm coming from. So I am now, since COVID-19, actually in a full private telehealth practice. It involves individual consulting. I also do speaking, both over the internet as well as, thank goodness, back to some in person. And being online has been a big shift as well, too. I've started an online membership, Success Stories membership over the past year. And social media has actually been a big part of my practice right from the very beginning. Um, I have mostly used it as service marketing. What I mean by that is I put things out about twice a week with the intent to give education, encouragement, lessons, a bit of a sample, if you will, of what sports psychology is and can do for my followers. As you can see, it's Instagram, Twitter, all of them. YouTube, I've got a mental toughness in 60 seconds video series. And then very recently, don't have a lot on there yet, but getting on the TikTok bandwagon. So that's my experience and where I want to come at you from. Because there's so much activity with social media, there's some things that we already know. The symptoms of anxiety and depression we know have increased with the onset of the pandemic. And it turns out that social rates of rates of social media have also increased during this time, and figuring that's probably a coping mechanism for people to connect with each other. And while that's a great thing, at the same time, we've also found that social media use is associated with worse mental health during this time. Now, maybe that's because of the comparisons, maybe it's because of it's not real connections and there's no substitute for it. And that's beyond the scope of this presentation. But the fact remains is that this is where our athletes and our clients are living. There is so much more activity going on. And we, as mental performance consultants, have an opportunity to be in that space where our athletes are and offer some encouragement as well as education. So despite my long history in social media, I want to say that I am not a social media expert. You're not going to hear anything about how to up your followers or get a million likes. We're really just going to focus on the content here. And I've got 3 guidelines for you that are really just in my opinion, but I think my colleagues, and we'll find out if you agree. And the first is when you're going to put something out into your social media, really focus on what your followers are experiencing. Why are they following you? What are they going through? And how can you speak to them? Not what you want to tell them. There are really 2 big differences there. Sometimes of what people want to hear or need to hear or why they're following you, and then our own desires about what to do, what we want to preach on, or what we think is good to put out into the universe. And so I want to take about a minute here and just show you the beginning of one of my videos to give an example of what it's like to listen to the symptoms out in public. Okay, this is making me anxious, this mask. I got to tell you a story. So I'm walking through the grocery store and just getting groceries, and all of a sudden I'm getting this anxiety, and I'm, of course, like seeing everybody else with masks, and I'm wondering, is this the virus, the fear, and I'm getting anxious, and it's actually getting kind of unbearable. And I come home and everything calms down and I'm all right. Well, today it happens again. I'm out doing different types of shopping. And once again, I'm going from one store to the next. And as the day is going on, I'm getting more and more anxious. And I'm starting to think, my gosh, like, am I developing an anxiety disorder, panic? Is the stress of the virus getting to me? And then I realized what I was doing. I was mouth breathing. When we wear a mask, it's harder to breathe. It's harder to breathe. There's a restriction. So I found myself breathing like that, minute after minute, hour after hour. And what that does when we breathe through our mouth like that, it activates our sympathetic nervous system. Our fight or flight response gets up. Our heart rate increases, our breathing is going short and shallow and in the chest, and it creates anxiety. And so then my head follows that my body is getting excited and feeling anxious, so my head starts to think the anxious thoughts. And so I want to, warn you about this and say, if you're finding the same thing, if you're finding yourself out there and getting anxious in public, it might be how you're breathing with your mask. What you want to be able to do is take in slow, deep breaths through your nose, nasal breathing. that will help promote bringing it down into your diaphragm.
And so I go on from there about how to breathe, and you guys know all of that content. But what I really want you to focus on at this point is how much I was talking about their experience and then offering scientific, evidence-based solutions to their problems. And it really resonated with the community. So a couple of comments that were posted there. I do have that problem. I am panicking when I'm wearing a mask. Well, try breathing from the nose. Thank you. I thought it was just me. And then Sly Fox talked to a lot of details about all the symptoms that this person was going through, crying, getting hot. And so we know that this really resonated with what they were looking for. And I was trying to solve their problem, not having some agenda of my own. Another video that I had done illustrates point number 2. Concentrate on the message impact, not on the number of views, because we can do a whole bunch of things to kind of make the videos more entertaining or to get more followers or this or that, and do what you need to do. But ultimately, look, I'm going to tell you the truth. I want more followers. I want more people to view this because I want, if it's going to matter and if I'm going to make the impact, I want to make an impact on a lot of people. But I've also had to kind of tell myself, what's the message, particularly with the COVID situation, that people needed to hear, even if a lot of people didn't hear it. And sometimes I had to battle between that. And this one in particular was one that you can see, it only got 300 views. And it was just bugging me that everybody was like, well, we're all in this together. Because I certainly didn't feel like we were in this together. I had lost my job. There's a lot of changes going on in my life at that time. And when people were like, oh, we're on this together, I was like, hell no, I'm in this by myself. Nobody's here with me. I had gotten COVID myself, recovered. And so I wanted to resonate with my followers who might have been feeling the same thing I was, but that they did feel alone, that they didn't feel as positive or as optimistic as other people were. They didn't feel as supported. And so this message I thought was very important. To have that impact and get the followers that were really feeling by themselves and maybe even bothered or invalidated by what was popular at the time of the mantra of we're all in this together. To illustrate a little bit more, I'll just get to that middle sentence of the context of what I had said there. Please don't say that we're all in this together, because we're not. Despite the support, we each have individual, unique experiences that are ultimately mean we're going through this alone. It's the same storm that we're in, but some are in yachts, others are in rowboats, and still others are clinging to a tattered life vest. And hearing that many are doing well, saying we're all in this together, it can undermine the pain and suffering some of us are in. No, there's a wide range of experiences. Some are thriving, others are dying. I see and respect your individual pain. And then I go on about, and there's a lot more after this. It's not a big downer, but it's more so about how to empower yourself and be responsible, but at the same time, be strong through that. Now, I don't know why there's only 300. The mask one got more, not a ton either, but like 800 or 900. And I'm guessing that's because it wasn't a popular message, but I do believe that it was important. And more importantly than that, it was scientifically accurate, which brings me to point number 3. We have to avoid the topics and issues outside our areas of competence that can lead to misinformation and increased distress. I mean, anybody with a social media channel can put themselves out there, and you've probably seen and heard a lot of it without credibility. But we represent our field, and we have a responsibility as trained professionals to stay within our lane, stay in our lane, and speak about what we know and what we're qualified to talk about. And so sometimes, particularly around the topics of the last 2 years, COVID and any number of other issues that we're dealing with as a country, I caution you to kind of say, hey, is this my opinion? Is this where I stand? Or is this in my professional boundary that I can express? So again, some examples. The first video I had done, everybody's getting sport canceled in the very first month. It was the first video I put out, and I focused on what psychologists do. I validated their distress, talked about focusing and coping strategies. I did go to encourage safety, but I figured there's enough evidence about hand washing and physical distancing that I could talk about that. And then how they might want to look at this adversity as a growth opportunity, all well within our competence. And you'll notice with the mask anxiety video that while I was giving information about anxiety and the trigger was the mask, I wasn't preaching about whether they should or shouldn't wear a mask. That still continues to be a heated topic. And it's one that, even though I do have an opinion about it, I thought it was important to stay away from in my social media. This one here was called Run as Fast as You Can, Not as Fast as You Can't. And again, it was in response to how I felt like people were talking about resilience and everybody had to be resilient and be strong. And I started to get fearful for my athletes that were still scared and maybe not doing so well. So I took this as an opportunity to challenge perfectionism and the need to be okay and offer the opportunity for compassion and self-compassion. And again, psychologists can address this. This one I was really disappointed with because honestly, I want you to look this one up, the high performance healthcare. I was grateful for all the people in healthcare, but they were burning out. So I did this long 11-minute video and I covered strategies to improve recovery, like sleep and exercise and hydration. I did clips all over the neighborhood. And it was great. It was all sports psych stuff. So great, again, in my lane stuff, but only 135 views. But that's okay, because if one or two of those 135 got real benefit out of it, then that's what I'm doing this for. Not everything's going to be a hit. Not everything's going to go viral. And then in the last one, as I said, we're not all in this together. Again, validating the different experiences. And again, psychologists, we deal with these feelings, whether they're popular or not. But here's what I didn't go into. Have you noticed that there's a big divide on vaccination? And I had to really consider whether or not I was going to address this, because I have a strong opinion in one direction or the other. But when you start to look at what's out there, and you can see by these two examples, polar opposites about whether we're saving lives or potentially risking killing people. My body, my choice, versus people saying, no, you've got a responsibility to other people here. It's not just your body. And then it continues to get a little bit more ridiculous. Like this one here, like, what do we do about our kids? We all care about our kids. Well, yes, definitely vaccinate. No, you'll be killing them. Protect them and don't. It gets more intense. Now we start to move to things that are no longer scientifically arguing, but you see here that we can get pretty insulting. And then my favorite, like this really got pretty far with bumper stickers and things that we're seeing, that it's moving so far out of what the health recommendation is. And so before I started to think about whether I was going to post on this as a public service announcement, one direction or the other, I had to think about my followers and say, do I want to divide them? Do I want to put myself in a position where I might offend half while support the other half? And maybe even more importantly, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a medical doctor, despite this picture, which this was for a podcast that I had done with artists, and they do these artistic things. And so it's interesting that this had come up. It had nothing to do with the vaccine. It's all about my course, The Psychology of Performance. But because I was Dr. Eddie, he put me in this. But the fact is, I'm not a medical doctor. So I feel like I shouldn't have an opinion about whether I'm talking about vaccination or not. I haven't done the studies. I haven't read all the literature. I don't know what the long-term effects are or aren't. It's out of my area. So I've chosen just to stay away. So point number 3 is I encourage you to avoid the topics and issues that are outside our areas of competence. This can lead to a lot of misinformation and increasing distress. And as a reminder, the other points, concentrate on the message impact. Don't worry about your number of views. And as you're having guidelines for content, focus on what your followers are experiencing. How can you serve them based on what they're going through and not on what you want to tell them? Thanks so much for your time. Enjoy the conference.
Welcome, everyone. So for my portion, what I'll be covering and going through today is COVID and the impact on student athletes. In particular, what's not being said in the media. There's a lot of things that have been covered, certainly a lot of things, both pros and cons of what we learned about how we're supporting student athletes during this and what the opportunities are ahead. As I approach this with the media, it's going to be from 2 parts. Towards the end, we'll get a little bit more into how to use the media in a more effective manner. And then 2, just what have been some of the things that we have captured in media, whether it's from research articles, newspapers, what do we know so we can better highlight the opportunities as we go forward. I have an extensive background working with student athletes outside of the military. college athletics, Division I, II, and III has been an area I've been very intimate with. And during COVID was an opportunity to really take a step back and relearn all over again about what's going on, to better capture Gen Z, for lack of better words, for student athletes today. And so the intent of this is, if we're looking at our opportunity, how are we really better empowering today's student athletes? And I will talk a lot about equitable access, but from the perspective of how do we better include student athletes in the support that we're trying to provide them, especially with what we're learning about the next generation. So what's on tap? I think first, it's best to let's capture what we know. Most of it in the NCAA and student athlete trends will be very familiar areas of research and things we've seen in the media. Then we'll shift a little bit more on the Gen Z trends to then really discuss the opportunities are ahead for us when it comes to improving our support and better empowering the student athlete population in particular. So what did we learn during COVID? So both the NCAA and the University of North Texas provided very substantial studies of what the student athlete experience was during COVID. And this won't surprise you. We've seen this all over the map when it comes to increased stress. Upwards of 70% of student athletes had some level of increased stress or distress. And then also maintained low engagement. There was upwards of even 80% that just weren't engaging with mental health resources. And I want to be very specific because this is one of the opportunity areas. We're talking about the mental health counseling in particular. One thing as well, the increase in technology. And so I'll break each one of these down here a little bit more. I'll go quick through this part so we can spend more time on the opportunities ahead. But certainly part of the increased stress was mentioned was due to training resources. Because campus is shut down, they couldn't be there, and they were left on their own to figure out how to gain access to continue training and stay ready. And then, of course, mental health access. Not available to be on campus, so what does that look like? And then in terms of technology uses, there's two things I wanted to hit on in particular. Certainly for us, there was an increase in mental health services through Zoom, Simple Practice, those type of technologies that allow for the virtual meeting space. And then also increased in accessible Wi-Fi. And this one kind of gets glossed over a little bit. But when student athletes go home, they don't all go home to the same neighborhood area, which means one of the initiatives that was done, and this had nothing to do with higher ed, but I think it's worth mentioning, is bringing accessible Wi-Fi to neighborhoods that are underserved. Doesn't mean that that was done to its full impact, but technology really doesn't mean anything if you don't have access to it via Wi-Fi. So those are considerations that can have a real impact on what some athletes had available versus others didn't. So just some things to consider. Here's what didn't change, and I think this is the part specific to the NCAA landscape where we have our big opportunity. So today is the same of even in the 90s. It's still a 2 to 3 week average wait. And I'm talking about seeking therapy or counseling, meeting with a psychologist or counselor to work on mental health. And that utilization rate is still in the low 30% range on average, lower or higher university dependent. Excuse me. And in one location, just to give you a snapshot of what a realistic day in the life looks like, you can have one counselor for 100 to 200 athletes. It's just the way it is. And that's budgeting, it's the organization of how we're trying to provide services. But here's the opportunity. So although the NCAA is mandating that resources are available, it doesn't regulate. It doesn't regulate how each institution chooses to allocate what that can look like. And that is an area that I think we have a lot of opportunity to have a bigger voice in what this can look like. So here's what's not being said in the media. and this is one area that I think can really hopefully spark our curiosity as we're going forward, because this is something that I see as someone who is unlicensed, but working in tandem in a lot of situations with licensed individuals. Why are we continuing to try and improve the support of mental health without the input of student athletes? And the reason I say that is if we look at a lot of research, there's extensive studies on athlete attitudes towards consulting, but we're really typically talking about one service, and that is, are you willing to meet with a mental performance person or a mental skills coach, psychologist? We're still battling the stigma. So that's great that we're seeing that, because what has been documented in the media is the athlete accounts of the importance of seeing someone. That's fantastic. But that's one type of service. And in the NCAA in particular, that's the dominant service. So what do we need to know from student athletes to be able to work with that more effectively? And this is now with Gen Z, and this is the area where I want to spend a little bit more time on today. Because how do they consume material? What is it that we need to know about Gen Z? What are their learning preferences? What are their priorities? These are just a few questions that we're going to walk through on the next couple slides. So I think first and foremost, how do they consume material? And this is really important to keep in mind. Gen Z is a social commerce generation. I'm on the back end of being a millennial. We're kind of that transition group where e-commerce was big for us. We were pre-internet. Internet came to be for a lot of us probably around junior high, high school. That's in that millennial group. And now things have evolved. We have e-commerce, we have a lot of things. But social commerce is very different. And when we get into learning preferences and priorities, we'll see a little bit why, but they are social commerce. So social platforms in particular, like Instagram and TikTok, are the top number 1 and 2 platforms where Gen Z is consuming information. That's where they go. Looking at peers, looking at their branding, their clothes, they do their shopping. It's all through these social network, or not social networking, but the social platforms. And that's an important consideration as we're going forward. And the one thing I thought was interesting from my colleague's presentation in the beginning was the private sector is already picking up on this, and they're getting very creative with the different ways to reach athletes today. And that's an area that we can look at when it comes to helping organizations make that realization as well. So when it comes to learning preferences, this is interesting because it's so similar to traditional adult learning theory. Things need to be within context. And that's so different for Gen Z. It has to have immediate relevance. It has to have context. And this is an interesting perspective. So keep this in mind with how we ask them about mental health. This is just an observation. So just to be very clear here, this is what I'm about to say is no longer rooted in some research and findings, but this is an observation. When we look at how we ask or position what we do, how often do we change the terminology? And I'm just going to share a quick survey that we're doing regionally. It's not included in here because it's not an academic survey, but it is worth considering. About 500 student athletes participated in this. And one question was very specific to their motivation to work on their well-being and resilience. 86% stated high motivation to work on that. When asked if they wanted to meet with a professional to work on that, that dropped to 52%. Now, a very small sample size, because as we've seen, the willingness to seek service, still in that 30% range. But the fact that the motivation is there, well, now what are some considerations to meet them where they're at, right? And we'll get into that next. But it's interesting because the way we provide the context around what we can do can also impact that enthusiasm, that motivation to engage. Lastly, though, the flexibility. and this is hitting also higher ed as a whole. I know this is a site conference, but education system will impact how we implement mental health services. So especially with student athletes. So we have to keep in mind what's happening in higher ed. So this shouldn't be a shock with Gen Z, but the flexibility of being more self-directed. I don't want to sit in a traditional class, because if you're telling me what I need to know, great, let me run with that. Why do I have to sit in a class? There's very much a challenging of the traditional educational settings here when it comes to learning. And when in particular with mental health, that's no different than learning any other course. I'm sitting down and learning about how to improve my mental health, for example. And so this is a good consideration for what that execution could look like. And in general, when we think about the priorities of Gen Z, they're very just highly active. Social justice, environment, and I mentioned self-directed in their education. They're highly engaged. They're not passive. Very much want to know the relevance of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we can improve our peers' situation. So highly involved in the community and the environment. So here's the opportunity, and this is the part that I want to end on and spend a few minutes helping us marinate with. Mental health, for the most part, as I said in the beginning, tends to focus on counseling, right, when we're talking. So whether it's group or individual, it's very difficult to make that accessible. Even if cost isn't an issue, it's still location. How do I get there? As we said, the access for even wellness centers is a long wait. So the education is where we can have a lot of creativity and a lot of flexibility, as well as we have a lot of peers in the community, licensed and non-licensed, that have a lot of knowledge base that we can provide something that's a little bit more accessible to the general population to get ahead of the curve. And providing education in that way, that's in a method that's accessible, but it's reflective of the learning needs of Gen Z. And once again, reinforcing this idea of social commerce. So I'll get really specific now. TikTok and Instagram, because they're the #1 and 2, are great opportunities to now get creative with how can we create educational content as a community that we can agree upon to get out there. In the private sector, as my colleague just presented on, it's being done in pieces, but we can really get this moving together if we have AASP, if we have APA, we have ACA working together to say, how do we use these platforms in a more effective manner? Whether it's with the organization themselves partnering with higher ed to put this educational programming together, or through higher ed. And here's why I say that. Many sport teams here, I won't get into percentages because I have the reference list on at the end of the slide deck, so you can look that up if you're interested. But they have Instagram accounts. They have social media accounts. So independent teams already have those things, and even the institutions have them to an extent, but we can use that a little bit more intelligently when it comes to providing that equitable access to education, especially knowing that that's where they're consuming the majority of their material. And we can find a way to regulate that. Some things to keep in mind, though, especially if you're already working for an organization as you're listening to this, Instagram is going to continue to get more regulated. It's already coming in hard on businesses, which means there's going to be a cost attached to that. So if you're trying to roll out products, whatever it is, there's going to be a cost. So if your institution has a budget to invest in that, great, that's a good avenue. When it comes to TikTok, though, because that's so new, this is really where the field is going. When we look at the research behind social media, TikTok is only going to get bigger. And right now that's free. You can get a lot of organic reach. It's free. And so that could be an opportunity to look a little bit more closely at how you can work with organizations or the institution to use that to create content for student athletes. So just some things to keep in mind. What I did want to say, I forgot to mention it earlier, so it doesn't feel like I'm just hammering the field here. The field of counseling has had hundreds of attempts of trying to work together to organize all the counseling theories, whether it's to integrate some, combine some, align some. Internally, we have been, it's not like we're not working on how to do that. I think we need to continue to look at that. So that way there's at least some baseline education that we can provide, and we can use the social media avenues to get some of that out. So just some things to keep in mind. So here's the resources page that I have here. But please feel free to reach out if you have any questions on this. I'm really interested to see how these studies come out in these little mini tests as we're looking at what student athletes are choosing to engage with versus what they're not. And what's been really promising so far, it's very early, but what's promising so far is the responses of being able to give them more autonomy with how they're approaching their mental health. And then we provide the swim lanes because we're the professionals. But it really allows a lot of freedom because we're not worried about diagnosing and treating. That still stays with the role of a counselor and a psychologist, where for us, the education and using the media to get that out can really be beneficial. So thank you for your time. And once again, please reach out for other questions. Happy to be a resource.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Harold Shinitsky. I'm a psychologist licensed in the state of Florida, specializing in sports psychology. I've had the opportunity of presenting with a number of our presenters in the past and a couple of the new ones for me. It is a delight to be a part of this presentation, as Joan had gave us the introduction, and our previous presenters of Russ and Eddie provided us with much more in-depth information, and this is great to be able to share. As you can see, I'll be covering the idea of how to deal with emotional toll with our athletes during the COVID-19 pandemic. A massive issue for so many of us personally and professionally. And we are going to dive into a lot of information. So I'm going to move forward on this, if that's okay with everybody. For starters, the outline, I'm going to hit upon the prevalence rates that we are aware of just COVID-19 and how it actually affects mental health. I'm going to identify that as it applies to athletes and the prevalence rates in terms of mental health for athletes. And then I'm going to shift towards talking about mental health, athletes, and the media, how we can actually collaborate with the media to get information out to the general public, but in more particular, also how to expand it to the groups of individuals and the population of athletes that we so dearly work with and want to make a difference in. Lastly, there's going to be a whole range of different strategies to help elite athletes manage mental health issues during COVID and beyond. To start out, I want to be able to share with everyone the latest research that came out that was rather impressive from last year, that anxiety and depression symptoms tripled from 2019 to 2020. And unfortunately, there was a disproportionate amount of stress placed upon different populations. And as we can see here, for those who happen to be Black or Latino, we see that in anxiety and depression, they shoulder the heaviest burden between 2019 and 2020. We have had continuing research that kind of speaks to this whole idea that there has been this tripling in terms of the symptoms reported by individuals. I also want to emphasize that women report more of the symptoms than men. And I want to emphasize that because I want to compliment women. You all are the brighter, wiser, smarter, much more proactive individuals. You all have the opportunity of reporting it. That doesn't mean that men don't experience it. It just might mean that women report it. And most of the time, women are seeking treatment rather than men waiting too long, and we end up getting hospitalized at a much higher rate. So I want to compliment women, and I want to encourage men to be more forthright and to be able to address this proactively when you're experiencing, whether it's symptoms of anxiety, depression, or other mental health issues. That's in general. Specifically, when we talk about it as its effect on the athletes, there was a wonderful study done a couple of years ago that talked about that there was no evidence that elite athletes have lower rates of mental health disorders than the general population. And as you can see here, 30% of college students and 50% of college students were reporting either that they had felt depressed over the last 12 months or were overwhelmed by anxiety over the last 12 months. This was a research study done in 2012. Comparing that to what's just taken place over the last year, there was again another study conducted by the NCAA with 37,000 student athletes around the country. And they were focusing on the mental health concerns. And it was reported by the student athletes 150 to 250% higher reported mental health concerns than those from the 2012 study. A significant increase during the COVID pandemic for our student athletes. And we need to be aware of that so we can be proactive rather than merely reactive, but it also provides a great opportunity for us to intervene and assist. The second bullet up there actually speaks to this wonderful idea that you will hear throughout the presentation. 70 to 80% of the coaches and teams have created an inclusive environment for all members of the team. This is vital when it comes to how an individual experienced the pandemic. And as you can see, as we move further down, that we see 25 to 30% talked about that they had difficulties that were piling up, where they felt that they could not handle it at that point, that they were overcome and overwhelmed. Interesting in the research, D1 versus D2 and D3 athletes, D1 in particular, felt the least amount of care from their coaches and about their well-being. Now, it was a significantly high amount. It was still in the 60s, but compared to D2 and D3, they still felt the least amount of care from their coaches about their well-being. Division I female athletes reported more than D1 males, that they felt the least comfort talking to their coaches about mental health. And again, a very interesting aspect. Gathering this information allows us to address from an intervention, but also my whole take is that of prevention, to be able to reach out proactively and address these student athletes on these topics. So the needs are there, obviously 150 to 250% increase, but are we creating an environment that necessarily reaches out and provides the services to the athletes? Fortunately, we have seen across the board, not only for the last several years, but recently, a number of elite athletes who report that they themselves have been struggling with mental health issues. This was once a taboo subject and was talked about in kind of a hushed tone. We have now gotten to the point where our society, we are much more open, accessible, open to have the conversation and respond to it. And so I want to encourage everyone who is listening to our presentation today to realize that part of our message to the media is that this might be new to them, but it's a reality that's been around for years, decades, and generations. It's just we haven't talked about it. So being able to talk about that specifically, how we can work with not only just addressing mental health in athletes, but also with the media. You want to be able to let everyone know that you can be an invited guest. Now, some organizations will reach out to you as an expert to talk about areas of your competence, to be able to speak within the ethical guidelines and principles. But you can also offer up to them, because they are oftentimes looking for material and content. And as an expert in our areas, we can share this. So you can reach out to different local media outlets and be able to talk to the news directors and editors. You can reach out and try to identify if there are online publications. Podcasts has become massive now, that you can provide content to large audiences. Write your own blogs, create articles, and put things on your own website. When you do reach out to them, if at all possible, you want to try to control them as much of the interview as possible by gathering up specific information. Prepare questions, offer it up, let them know what your answers or your thoughts would be. Convert any advanced evidence-based scientific research information into bite-sized morsels. Our job is not to impress our colleagues that we possess an advanced degree or talk above the viewing audience. We want to speak to them. So we want to make sure that we're communicating in a way that comes across to the general populace. And whenever possible, don't trivialize, don't sensationalize. That's how we can actually create problems, by sharing information, but in an unprofessional way. Continuing to move. Sports psychology, media, and the mental health. These are a variety of links that I've put together that you can take a look at. Are different episodes where I was asked to speak specifically on this topic of mental health and elite athletes. They're across the board. They are national in their range, and they're opportunistic in terms of the specific focus. What I'd like to share is how that you can use this to be able to get the message out. Mental health and elite athletes is a normal reality, and it's one that we want people to understand. We also want our athletes to understand that which increases their probability of then reaching out. So let's take a moment and just hear a brief trailer of an episode that I was a part of. Just because you're an athlete doesn't mean you're impervious or immune to having mental health issues. It's an equal opportunity condition.
Oh, yeah.
So we're now seeing individuals who are of this elite status that we put on a pedestal actually being willing to acknowledge, and the willingness and the strength to be able to come forward and admit, this is something that I'm struggling with. And we as a society are now being exposed to that. The great thing about media and working within that has an opportunity of taking your voice and spreading it to a much greater realm. And so when we want to look at the research and share this information with different media outlets, there are some specific research protocols that have identified different factors influencing mental health on student athletes. Bullard came out with this last year, and the factors that impacted the student athletes. When we are communicating within the media and reaching out to our athletes, we want to be able to let them know the factors include the discontinuation of resources, whether it's attendance at school or the athletic facilities, the nutrition centers. We understand that has a significant impact on the populace that we work with. Difficulties remaining motivated was stated by many of the athletes, a very high percentage of them not having a schedule for them, having to help them create their own schedule. Too many individuals their entire identity may be consumed within that of sport. And therefore, when the sports were canceled, a lot of them experienced depression and anxiety because they lost that sense of who they were, their identity. And as you can see, other issues there in terms of how young adults perform with schoolwork online. And as we heard earlier, the idea of excessive social media, 4 hours or more has been identified as a negative. We know that at that point, increase in terms of depression and anxiety are commonly referred to as FOMO, the fear of missing out. When you're comparing yourself to others, unfortunately, there's a tendency of believing, I'm not there, they're looking like they're having fun, I must somehow have a negative experience then. Unfortunately, we whitewash things that go online. So you're only seeing the best of other individuals. You're not seeing the rest of them. And too many individuals, unfortunately, perceive it that way and are personalizing it, and therefore they experience depression and anxiety. A number of things that I find very important to share with the media to be able to get this information out to our athletes and the general public is that there are certain barriers in terms of not being able to manage anxiety and depression. And the 4 of them are listed here. When individuals use a perfectionistic tendency, all or none, this unfortunately sets people up with an unrealistic expectation. Most things can be going well, one thing occurs, and the next thing you know that they're overwhelmed by it. If I asked you right now to not focus, not think of a big purple elephant, especially the one with pink polka dots, there is this reality that if we look at brain science, when you're telling yourself not to focus on something, the brain will focus exactly on that because that's all you're focusing on, even though it's a not. So the reality is you cannot tell your brain what not to focus on. If you do that, obviously you become consumed with whatever that thought is. The ability is to tell your brain what you want to focus on. Individuals who catastrophize, who take a single issue, generalize it to the total, take something from today, project it onto the tomorrow, and believe that they have no method of addressing it, they unfortunately can experience significant anxiety and depression. And the last one of these 4 is future predicting. I always like to say to the individuals I work with, the only thing you can factually tell me about yourself is the past. The future is unknown. And so when people begin to future predict, pardon my French, but they're kind of damning their future because of the past. The reality is that there are a multitude of options. Unless you are doing this future predicting, then you pigeonhole and you start going down a path based on self-limiting thoughts. Now, fortunately, AASP came up with a wonderful list of different tips to be able to manage during COVID. As you can see listed here, I added the first one for clarity based on summing up what they were identifying in this list. And then we want to start out by controlling the controllables, which are your effort, your attitude, your response. As it was identified, maintaining virtual communication. Remember earlier, we heard that 75 to 80% of the respondents of student athletes said that their coaches and teammates created an environment that was supportive. If we aren't connected to that, we lose our identity. Staying up to date on research, which is helpful because then we can make evidence-based information and decisions. Just because the health clubs might be closed or the workout facility or the nutritionist center is closed, we can create our own exercise regimen. Being able to monitor our own self-help, our emotions, and our mental health. Again, turning to our teammates, our coaches, or a mental health provider, very important. During this time of COVID, remind yourself of your why. What's the reason that you're doing it? It's easy to get through the easy times. It's more challenging during the difficult times. And this is one of those where something is happening out of our control. And whenever possible, create a routine. Rappensberger came up with some wonderful research this past year. And in particular, one of the identified quotes was teammates' social interaction. This goes back to having that supportive environment. Social support and connectedness experienced less identity dissolution following the abrupt cancellation of college sports and reported greater mental health and well-being. Again, if my identity is all sports and I've lost that, unfortunately, that's where we saw individuals having mental health and well-being problems. I always want to emphasize this message when we're talking with the media to be able to share this and get this out. There are 3 steps to managing this kind of social isolation that we're all in. And the 3 are productivity, enjoyables, and compassion. Productivity. We want to be able to send this message through media out to not only our patients and our athletes, but also the general populace. Productivity, doing something every day where you have maybe a start date or an end date, short-term goals leading to long-term goals. This gives you a sense of purpose, identity, value, self-worth. Every day we need to engage in this. In addition, every day you should engage in some activities that are enjoyable, that are reinforcing, rewarding, that release serotonin and dopamine in the brain, the feel-good chemicals within the brain. If it's not something that's fun, if you're not having some type of reinforcer in your day, something that's pleasurable, what's the whole point? So I encourage everyone to be able to not only do productive enjoyables, but also this 3rd one, compassion. Since you only control yourself, and we all know that unfortunately when there's more undue stress, people are more irritable, annoying, snarky, sarcastic, and even rude to loved ones. Knowing that everyone's going through this, you can understand where someone's coming in. Don't mirror them. Don't react necessarily and engage and kind of allow yourself to be consumed by the negative of the situation, but understanding. And with that empathy, we can actually lead with compassion. So each day, if we can be productive and doing enjoyables and lead with compassion. Now, this one I find vitally important. I cannot tell you how many times I keep getting asked back to talk about this and to share this in the media for our athletes with teams or to the general populace. And that I refer to as the 3 keys to life. Something small. Their perception, self-talk, and behavior. Everything in your life, everyone has an initial perception, point of view, perspective to everything. It's either positive or negative to everything. You might say you're neutral, but if I push you, I can find out you're neutral positive or neutral negative on whatever topic it is. It's 100% you. And it can be incredibly accurate. It can also be incredibly inaccurate. It can be based on reality, or it could be just some monster you create in your head. Now, perception leads and influences self-talk. It doesn't control it. And it leads and influences behavior, but it doesn't control it. Self-talk either confirms the initial point of view, which is negative or positive, or challenges the initial positive or negative point of view. If it confirms it, you continue down that path. Like if I said to someone, we have a pandemic, the workout facility is closed, and someone goes, I guess I'm screwed. I'm just going to put on the COVID-19. Their initial perception is negative. Their self-talk confirms it, and they continue down. And guess what? It influences their behavior. So self-talk either confirms negative or positive perception or challenges negative or positive perception. So your self-talk, in essence, either talks you into or talks you out of everything in your life, which then leads to your behavior. And as I always like to tell individuals and share this on news, media, podcasts, whatever it might be, you can have any thought or feeling. Thoughts and feelings do not equal behavior. If I asked you if any of you have been really mad at someone, did you immediately go up to every single one of those people and hit them? Odds are probably not. So you were angry, filled with rage, vengeance, maybe even visualized it, but yet you controlled your behavior, because behavior is always a choice. It's always controlled. So in life is either perceived positive or negative for this situation. Your self-talk either confirms or challenges, and it leads to the behavior. And think about it. Whatever behavior you practice, you get better at. So if you're doing something that's constructive and you confirm it, that behavior continues. If you're doing something that's unhealthy and you confirm it, even the unhealthy, whatever you practice, you get better at. So the goal is for individuals who might have a negative perspective on something and be able to challenge that to a positive one. That's where growth, change, movement occurs for individuals. So I always like to share these 3 keys to life. So just imagine with regard to the pandemic, there are some people who went in and had a negative perspective and took it straight on down that path. For the individuals I work with, we're encouraging them to have a positive perspective and a self-talk that confirms that, and behavior that empowers them. One of the things that's rather important as we move through this is the idea of how do you manage your stress. So we talk about this idea of the 3-step Olympic calm. Many of you within our profession are well aware of each one of these, and I always like to use the 3 of them in this specific order. The research shows that there's a synergistic effect, and so teaching the general public, student athletes, or using it through media, being able to communicate when you're feeling discomfort, stress, what we want to be able to do is realize I cannot control things outside of my control, but within me I can. And so as we heard earlier from Eddie, that idea of not doing the mouth breathing, but breathing through your nose. You don't want the sympathetic system kind of kicking into overdrive. We want to be able to engage in diaphragmatic breathing, increasing oxygen to your brain and your body. You think clearer, option development can take place, and you remain more relaxed. Muscle relaxation. I do it referred to as cephalocaudal, from head to toe. I actually have individuals practicing it from contracting to relaxation, but followed by visualization. Now, we know from the research all 3 of these work independently, but when you use them in a synergistic, in a sequential fashion, we actually have a greater impact neurologically, which then leads to a greater impact physiologically. So the amazing thing is we can work with the media in mental health for our athletes and being able to do it in a proactive way. So here's that kind of summary from what we were sharing. We know from the research that mental health issues for elite athletes this past year increased 150 to 250%. We know that from the research. We can address it, and we can do it proactively. We can reach out to different media outlets to be able to share expert-based, research-based information. We want to encourage our athletes to maintain that connectedness with their teammates and coaches for their identity. And remember to control the controllables. Create a schedule, improvise your workouts, monitor your own mental health and well-being. Remember your why. I want to thank you for your time and attention. It has been a pleasure to be a part of this panel, and I hope that the rest of the conference is also exceptional. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Leveraging Technology as a Pandemic Response, Psyching Runners-Up for Virtual Marathons. I am Dr. Michelle Karoulis. I am an AASP Fellow and Professor with the Family Institute at Northwestern University, and also Director of the Chicago Psyching Team. I'd also like to acknowledge the coordinator of the Chicago Psyching Team, Bridget Montgomery, who has done quite a bit of work on this project also. I do also want to give this in honor of Kate Hayes, who was so instrumental in supporting not only me in developing a psyching team, but so many other people across the nation. So as the Chicago Psyching Team, our motto is, we are here to psych runners up. And we've engaged a lot of different types of media to help our worldwide running community move through the shock of pandemic era marathons and virtual races. And we all know that the research in our field shows that utilizing sports psychology skills, mental toughness training, mental skills, whatever you call it, we have the ability to help people push beyond what they think that they can do. And that's what we wanted to do in light of the pandemic that we're still in. We also know that people absolutely love sports, and we have a $71 billion industry here in the US. And specifically for endurance sports, it's a $3 billion enterprise. People absolutely love engaging in sports and participating in different ways. We also know that there were many people who have been enrolled in health clubs or fitness centers. Within 2019, our numbers are at 184 million. We also know people love running. So worldwide, we have almost 1.3 million people who have crossed a marathon finish line, and almost 500,000 of those people are from the US. When we think about marathons, especially here in Chicago, we think about the Abbott World Majors, and these are some of the most prestigious events to participate in across the world. There are 6 marathons, which are Berlin, Chicago, New York, Tokyo, Boston, and London. And people who complete these are called 6-star finishers. So it's a really big deal to be able to participate in every single one of these events. This started in 2008 just to give a boost to elite running. Now, unfortunately, as we all know, COVID impacted sports, and COVID impacted endurance events. 4,200 endurance events were canceled within the US. I'm sure there are more than that, but that's what we are aware of. And it was just really upsetting for everybody. As we've already heard, the pandemic has caused a lot of psychological stress, emotional stress, physical issues too. And over half of the athletes who have been surveyed have told us that they are still concerned about the impact of COVID-19. We do know also, though, that our athletes are extremely resilient, and we had to switch from our in-person races to virtual finish lines. And data by Run Sign Up showed that we had nearly 2.2 million people who registered for virtual races in the last year. And for Chicago, we had over 26,000 residents or individuals worldwide actually who participated. And Boston, for example, had over 16,000 finishers. So a virtual race is not new to those of us in the running world, but it is new to other people who haven't experienced this. And these gained popularity due to the fact that we were all isolated and had to train and participate on our own. And it really can help marathoners and people running different distances reach their own goals. I know for myself in the winter, I used to do a lot of virtual events, but specifically on a treadmill. So if you're interested in participating in virtual events, it's really important to look at the regulations and the rules, because some of these events will not allow you to participate via a treadmill. So I always pay close attention to that when I'm choosing a virtual event. So cycling teams were developed quite some time ago, and they were inspired by a speech given in 1969 from the American Psychological Association president, who encouraged people to give psychology away. And this is a message that we've heard through many of our institutions, our associations, to do pro bono work and to help people demystify mental health so they feel more comfortable reaching out and normalizing these conversations. The silver lining of COVID was our ability as a Chicago cycling team to pair with the Bank of America Chicago Marathon. So we were able to reach individuals across all 50 states and 130 countries. The purpose of the psyching team, again, is to destigmatize mental health and to teach athletes on a very large scale how to use mental skills and our techniques. This is also providing an opportunity for graduate students to practice in the field and for our colleagues who are not so familiar with the field of sports psychology to learn a little bit more about what we do. It's also really important when providing any kind of public health information or doing any kind of media from an expert perspective to follow our codes of ethics. And we paid particular attention to the ACA Code of Ethics, of course, AASP and APA Code of Ethics, particularly being able to not provide diagnostics in the media. We are not diagnosing people. If we are diagnosing, we are not sharing that information publicly in any way whatsoever. But psyching teams don't provide diagnostics. We are providing public health education. Specifically with the Bank of America Chicago Marathon, it is one of the Abbott World Majors, and we have had over 900,000 people cross our finish line since 1977. And one of the things that our race director finds to be really exciting is that we've had 5 world records accomplished here on our course. So that's really exciting. Not only is this a great event for our participants, but we have a huge community in Chicago who is super, super supportive. And we have just under 2 million people who come out as spectators. So as our role in the Chicago psyching team, when we started to have conversations with the Bank of America Chicago Marathon, it was really important to establish trust with each other as organizations. And by doing that, we looked at how to demonstrate expertise from our perspective. That included a really thorough review of the literature. We created a beautiful proposal and then talked about opportunities that we could work together on. And I created a letter of agreement, really stating very clearly what I would do as the director of the psyching team. This is an example of what our proposal looked like. And I have to give Bridget credit for this, for just designing a beautiful program for us to share with the Bank of America Chicago Marathon in our initial planning meeting and our initial pitch meeting. So the structure of our psyching team was myself as the director, as the subject matter expert, professor, experienced presenter, and marathoner. And Bridget is our coordinator, who is the Chicago expert and historian. She's a champion runner, and she also has extensive mental health knowledge and knowledge in sports. During the virtual experience, we had to come up with plans very, very quickly. I think we had less than a month to do this. So it was definitely a sprint and not a marathon in terms of preparation. What happened at this point is when we did pair with the marathon organization, we worked together to have media interactions, which included interviewing 3 specific runners. One was an Olympic athlete, one was a first-time marathoner, one was an individual who has run every single Chicago Marathon since 1977. So that was a panel discussion to hear their perspectives from different points of view to provide encouragement for runners and participants who were out there. This also allowed us to engage runners and participants who maybe haven't done any kind of events before. So we had a 1 mile, 5 mile, a 10K, half marathon, and then the full marathon that people could participate in. I created a free Mind Over Marathon workbook to encourage people to really look at the mental side of training. And I did 3 Facebook Live broadcasts from different spots in Chicago. And because of our work together with the virtual marathon, we were also asked to come back and participate in the virtual Shamrock Shuffle, which is another huge event here in Chicago. These are, again, examples of how we demonstrated expertise as a psyching team and worked with the organization to engage with the media. They also really supported us with their press releases, so that was exciting. The virtual expo also featured our sponsors and links to different types of resources that runners could utilize. And they had the opportunity to print out a virtual finish line and race bibs. The week of the race, we also had daily content, which was nice for people to have. Our role, as I said, was a very, very heavy lift, and we were successful because of outstanding teamwork and commitment and love for the sport. So our enthusiasm was contagious, and we wanted to help others learn about our field of sports psychology. These are examples of the Mind Over Marathon workbook. And again, this was a free workbook. And this is available still online for people to download. We really encourage people to work to create lasting community partnerships. So we continue to pair with Chicago Events Management, who puts on the Bank of America Chicago Marathon. We had the Shamrock Shuffle and the 2021 Bank of America Chicago Marathon, which will be an in-person event. Our Shamrock Shuffle was really successful too. And given the fact that people have a lot of virtual fatigue, virtual race fatigue, we were still really happy with our 8,000 plus runners who participated. We also had Psyching Team Instagram stories every Monday. And this was curated through our text. So we provided the content, and then the organization made it look beautiful and put it up on their social media. So you see fun little graphics that they utilized here. One of the most exciting things was creating a visualization script that was shared with the Shamrock Shuffle folks. And here it is for you to listen to.
For 4 decades, the Shamrock Shuffle has kicked off the spring racing season in Chicago. And as we all prepare for the return of in-person races, let this year's Shamrock Shuffle be a celebration of one more virtual finish line, of our collective resilience as runners, and of our ability to persevere. Now is the time to imagine yourself effortlessly striding down the streets of Chicago as you remember your why. Hear the music of the bagpipes singing you down LaSalle Street. Picture the Irish dancers tapping away as you push through each step. Smell the air turning from winter to spring. Maybe your why for running this year's Shamrock Shuffle is to prove that you can when others have shouted that you can't. Maybe your why is to raise funds for a charity, to set a PR, or to keep yourself motivated. This weekend, harness the power of your why and let it propel you to the finish line. You've got this.
So as I mentioned, we are super stoked to return to the road for the in-person event. To prepare for that, we continue to provide Instagram stories, media. I'm doing a video every week for the 18 weeks of training. And also we paired with WGN. Oh, I'm sorry, actually, I'm going to redo this slide. So we also provided Instagram posts and stories. We paired with NBC Chicago to provide different kinds of 60-second marathon moments, including the Psyching Team. And you would see the training from weeks 1 to 18 on Instagram stories. So that was a really fun partnership too. I want to provide some really stellar takeaways in terms of building community partnerships. My recommendation is to provide very clear ideas and the goals and why this is important and why it will help your community. Make sure you talk about research, risks, and benefits, and incorporate your code of ethics into your proposals. When you develop your proposal, be very thoughtful in the type of language that you use and providing really clear examples of how you would interact with your community partners. And talk about other partnerships. Talk about how you might contribute to their existing partnerships. Thinking about also how to deliver information in different kinds of modalities. We have in-person, live videos, recorded websites, workbooks, and pairing with local media. And you want to look at ways to strengthen your partnerships be open, be flexible, and have fun with these opportunities. We have quite a few resources that are available. And again, we are just so excited to be able to utilize technology to reach a wider population. I think this is extremely important, especially when we think about socioeconomic demographics with the ability for everybody to access this information for free. And also when we think about different types of physical abilities, where people who might not have confidence to be with us in person in terms of feeling judged for whatever their abilities are, having virtual events allows them to have the confidence on their own to build up to maybe interacting with others, because the running community is absolutely supportive and outstanding. So thank you so much for your time and for listening. And we're here to psych you up. So come on out with one of our marathons.
Okay. Again, my name is Dr. Joan Steininger, and I forgot to mention that I'm also a faculty at the San Jose State University teaching sports psychology. And I just want to thank our presenters, Dr. O'Connor, Dr. Schnitsky, Dr. Karoulis, for their outstanding presentations on a variety of subjects. And it's been exciting to listen to you all and be part of this. Dr. Flatten talked about the whole idea of athletes having a voice and how important it is. And that sometimes the athletes don't get the voice they need. His presentation was moving beyond traditional media outlets, such as research, and moving into using multiple forms of media to better understand today's student athletes. I loved the comments that he made about focus and concentrating on the message impact and avoiding topics and issues that are outside our areas of competence. And I think Michelle referred to the whole importance of, ethics within our the media in particular, because we want to represent, as these three presenters have done, good, solid professional faces with the media. And Harold really went into the mental health issues that I think have come up bigger than ever within COVID, and particularly much more so in the Black and Latino communities, because they've had way less resources than a lot of other people of color groups. So it was nice to hear him talk about that. And then to finish up with Michelle talking about this phenomenal project of putting the Chicago Marathon virtually and cultivating people from all over the world, was just a phenomenal look at a very complex process. And I think each presenter did a beautiful job talking about their area of expertise. The last thing I'm just going to mention is I have, as many people know, some expertise in female athletes, and particularly in women of color people athletes. And I just want to mention that in COVID, it was very hard for many Olympians and to have to put it off another year. And one of the most brave of those Olympians, who actually came back from almost dying after having a baby, was Allison Felix in her 5th Olympics. Phenomenal. And so not only was she there, she went from almost dying and talking about having trouble walking to not only participating, but receiving 2 more medals that put her over Margaret Otley and 1 over Carl Lewis, so that she is now the actual athlete, an African-American woman here in the United States, that is the most decorated track and field. And I don't think that enough attention has been given to her at all, quite frankly. And I think the coverage media-wise in the Olympics of women was great. But as I wrote in an opinion piece to my local newspaper, it was great, but now where is it gone? It's a problem for media, for women across the board. It's a problem with women of color getting criticized for the way they look and how they are. And just as a wrap up in terms of our medal count in this past Olympics, we had 257 athletes receive medals. Of those 257 athletes, females received 164 medals, and the males only received 93. So you can see that women are really moving hard, and it got a lot of attention in the media. It felt much more balanced. There was more prime time. And I think that with the media coverage that's going on in all these areas that we talked about now, I mean, with Eddie's talking with people and Harold's really talking in depth about mental health, and Michelle's tremendous accomplishment to be the director of the Chicago cycling team, marathon cycling team. I think all this work we're doing in media is making a big difference. And I would really like to encourage more people in AASP to become part of the media SIG, because I think we're doing some incredible groundbreaking work, and I'd really like to see it continue. So thank you, panelists, and thank you to AASP and anyone who's watched, and keep your mind about media, because I think we're making big progress. I actually, because I'm going to tell one more story and then I'll shut up. Because they weren't covering enough sports stories during this time, the local sportscaster who I'm always on, who happens to be an African-American man, and his name is Vernon Glenn. He's been making it a point to do media coverage of women. And actually my latest book, Stand Up and Shout Out, Women's Fight for Equal Pay, Equal Rights and Equal Opportunities in Sports, he actually did a whole media piece on it that appeared at the 5:30 and 5:20 and 6:20 news on CBS here in Bay Area. So it's nice to see improvement along so many lines. And thank you all again for listening in, and we all hope, and I'm sure you did, learn a lot from this presentation.